As you can see by looking at the Turbulence window, this is version 1. For version 1 software, it's actually kind of amazing. I've used it to good effect on a motion picture called Iron Sky and on TV shows like Fringe, whenever we needed to blow something up. You can kind of think of a tool like this as the cloud tank you don't have to clean, which obviously is superior to a normal cloud tank. But let's just start stepping through things, and I'll explain as I go. So, Turbulence FD comes with its own tree of menu items. The main one really is the fluid container panel. I'm just going to set my cache directory to some computation that I'd done earlier, because whilst TFD is actually really quick as fluid dynamics software goes, that's really quick as fluid dynamics software goes. So I'm going to try to keep the amount of progress bars to a minimum as much as I can. So, wow, okay. Also, this machine is one I'm not overly familiar with, so there may be the occasional stutter while I get going. So, yay, mushroom cloud, or big billowy explosion. What are we seeing here? This white cuboid here is the Turbulence FD simulation volume. This volume contains a bunch of voxels. I think we've all played with hypervoxels before, I hope. But what these voxels effectively are is a three-dimensional grid of cubes. And each of those cubes contains certain pieces of data, whether it's temperature data, velocity data, density data. Each one of the cells in this volume are data containers from which information is passed from one to the other. Now, there are quite a few really cool things about Turbulence, and being able to look around the contents of your volume in OpenGL is really one of them. It takes so much guesswork out. But I'm going to be assuming that people will be grabbing the demo and playing with it, so a couple of things to point out before we really start getting into the meat of the panel, which is that your view really needs to be set to at least textured shaded solid, because as I say, all these voxels are textured data containers. So if we turn textured view off, you get none.
Mark, do you know what the specs are on the machine you're using, so we have some sense of how fast this is relative to what we might have it on?
Miss Verchigen.
Since it's my home machine, that I brought in the last minute.
Oh, so you got it from like the NSA or something? Yeah, maybe-ish.
I should say that this is not going to be the fastest machine you can get. It is an AMD FX 8150 processor, 4 modules on it, which show up as 8 CPUs in the task manager. So it's 4 shared floating point units that try to act like split. It's got 8 separate integer units. It's got 32 gigs of RAM on it. And I'm trying to remember what I've got for a video card. But
It's a GTX 550 Ti.
with 1 gig of RAM on it.
And that's going to be a thing.
I'm sorry.
No. This entire demo is thanks to Jen Hashigan for providing a last-minute machine, because mine's kind of broken. So, way to go, Jen.
It's just 1 gig of RAM. Doesn't seem like worth this.
That's very much a thing, because you can, if I direct your attention to the container panel, I think we can all guess what the start and continue buttons do, but let's just drop down to use GPU 0, GeForce GTX 550 Ti. I've got 2 options in there. I can simulate on the CPU, or I can simulate on the GPU. Let's just take a quick look at the difference between that. If I switch...
It tells you my specs.
Yeah, it's clever, isn't it? So, I'm just going to start this sim, and then we'll start digging into what's actually happening in there. As you can see, we've got a couple of little pieces of geometry down here, a couple of domes, that are emitting, I believe, temperature into the simulation volume that then convects and advects and billows appropriately. So, as we can see, simulating on Gen's 8-core, fairly competent CPU, pretty typical for an animator's home rig, I'd say, doing about 3.5 gigahertz. It's going a little bit slowly. So I'm going to stop that and hope I don't regret hitting the stop button, because as with many things, stop frequently means crash. Nevertheless, as much as I keep saying the word crash, Turbulence is pretty stable, all things considered. You do have to watch what you're doing, though. So I've just switched it to the GeForce card now. I'm going to hit start again. As you can see, that is visibly faster. The more GPU you give this piece of software to work with, the faster it goes. It really is an inherently multi-threading application. I use a GeForce 560 GTS 2 gig, and you know it goes pretty nicely. When I was working on Iron Sky, I had a Quadro. That was great. And I'm reliably informed that the current generation of high-end NVIDIA cards, like Tesla's, go like an absolute freight train. Now, there's one thing which is a caveat, and that is, in an ideal universe, when the GPU runs out of RAM, it'll flop back over to using the CPU. So things slow down, but don't actually stop. This is actually what's happening at the moment instead. The simulation had to abort because of an unexpected error. Well, it was unexpected to the software, but I knew it was coming. This is what happens when you run out of GPU RAM. Now, you can change horses in midstream, which is actually kind of awesome. I can flip over to the CPU. Let's actually try that from the start. I can, during... We'll be back after this message from our sponsors. So, with the GPU selected, I hit the start button, and the sim trundles along nicely. And we've actually got lots of little readouts up here that are telling us what's going on. It's telling me the dimensions of the grid in voxels, and the total voxel count. Yes, that is megavoxels, that's quite a lot, isn't it? And also, expected memory usages. Notice that it's expected to use 1.07 gigabytes on the GPU. So what I can do is, knowing where the simulation stopped last time, is then...
We're keeping an eye on the workspace readout.
Then flip over to using the CPU. So I can get a quick start on my sim, and then when I start to run out of GPU memory, flip over to using the CPU to continue the calculation. I am assured by the author of the software that new versions will make this switch over seamlessly. In fact, a new version dropped today, but I thought we had enough variables in play not to actually update and try to demo something I hadn't used yet. So as you can see, that's continuing to simulate. Now it's using the CPU. So this is nice. This means you can use whatever you have most of to continue the job. We've got a few frames of sim to play with in there. So let's stop simulating and start playing with it. So just a quick overview. To the joy of all, Turbulence does actually play quite nicely with VPR. Phew! So, as you can see, there's some smoke and flame happening here in the VPR window. If I flip back to textured shaded solid, and let me bring up the emitters panel as well, because these are basically the two parts. Fluid emitters, fluid container. Pretty straightforward. So what's actually happening in this scene to make all this roiling flame happen? It's actually kind of straightforward, despite the fact that the panels themselves can look like a maze of twisty tabs all alike. there's a very consistent and logical workflow happening. So I have two emitter objects. If I flip over to shaded solid view and make those guys actually visible, you can see we've got a couple of hemispheres down here. They are single objects rather than including their children. They are not collision objects, and they are filled. So the whole volume of the object is emitting into the simulation volume. I'll come back over each thing in more detail, but we're going over a quick overview right now. The textures on these objects, as you can see, it's a noise texture with very familiar controls for scaling and detailing and speed. Under the Force tab, as you can see, there's one item in use, and that's pressure. I'll go over everything in full detail later on, but just for right now, let's see what is happening with the pressure values on these hemispheres. We've got a brief burst of pressure that then cuts off. So all that means is the pressure of the volume, which is simulating a gas, therefore it is compressible, is being ramped up very early on and then cut off. So those...
Like pumping air into a water or something. Like
Exactly, or setting off an explosion. You get a prompt pulse of pressure that then discontinues, and what you've set off is left to do things to its own devices. And in terms of what actual data is being introduced to the simulation volume, we've got temperature being applied, again, in a manner that falls off, and the value of burn, which again is cut off at frame 20. So what these two parts are doing is the emitter is what's introducing data, introducing conditions into the simulation volume, which is where everything else happens. So the container itself, this first set of arguments, is pretty straightforward. Voxel size, that's the size of the grid cells within the simulation volume. Grid size is how many of these such and such size voxels occupy that. That's the volume that's divided into those voxels. Grid offset, that's just where's the volume container compared to the origin. Cache directory, which hard disk do you want to fill today? Because this generates a lot of data. It really does. But hey, disks are cheap, so not terrible. As we've reached the subject of voxel size, let's take a moment and talk about calculation speed and memory overhead. This granularity of the voxel size is a pretty straightforward measure of the amount of data we're moving around. Okay. Do you mind just turning it off? Okie dokie. I'm joking about turning off pacemakers, obviously. At least I hope it's obvious. Okay, so let's take a quick look at how the voxel size impacts what's happening in the volume. We've seen that simulating at a 10mm voxel size a few times now. We don't really need to see it again. So let's try a 50mm voxel size. Set to GPU. Start sim. Yes, overwrite the cache. Now, can anybody see any difference?
And it's all on the card right now too, isn't it?
Yep,
Because it's less for its food.
exactly. Boom! And I'm in my element. Fire. So, as you can see, the voxel size has a very real impact on simulation speed, memory overhead, the whole bit. It's generally sensible to use as big a voxel size as your system is capable of doing in real time, and then either increase the voxel size and resim when you're ready to go to final render, or have an evening where you can leave the computer alone. There is also a facility that is similar to Fume Effects, where one can up-res one's existing simulation, where rather than re-simulating with a smaller voxel size that can introduce different variances into the sim, it's just extrapolating a higher detail level from the existing simulation data. Again, we'll get into that in a little more detail. Seriously, I can just sit here and yammer on for about 3 hours about this piece of software, because there is a lot going on. And unless somebody stops me, I will.
Can you turn it off?
The turning it off is that little button there. Now please open again. Yay! Okay, cool. In the container tab, so we've got our basics of the volume size and volume base overall detail level. The cache folder is more than just caching, say, texture data. We're actually using that to store temperature data, velocity data, and data on all the different channels that Turbulence uses to evaluate its internal simulation. I'll come back to these in slightly more detail later, because different values have different properties, and when we're going through the different functions of temperature and burn and density and, most intriguingly, fuel, I'll come back to how the cache hangs on those. Next up, we have the simulation tab, and oh my word, look at all this. I will revisit all of these in full detail as we go along, but suffice it to say, the people who wrote this are quite clever and actually authored it with most values being appropriate for most scenarios. They figured, well, most people are going to want to use this to blow stuff up and burn it. So as a general rule, if that's what you're doing, the defaults work pretty well. All of these tabs sum up to create the explosion conditions here. In this instance, though, if I nip back to our emitters tab, as you can see, the channels that are being set are temperature and burn. So there are prompt values at the start of the simulation for the burn channel, which is generally and quite often used simply to drive flame, and the temperature channel, which does have the full set of temperature effects. Hot stuff will convect upwards, cool, dissipate, and fall again. So that's all being simulated. I'm going to come back to all these guys individually as we move along, but I'm just giving a skim overview right now. The viewport render, this stuff here, is most useful for switching which channel of the simulation is being represented in OpenGL. There are also little controls down here for doing the same, and which shader is being applied in OGL to that channel data. Have I lost anyone yet? Excellent, I love a smart crowd. And believe it or not, the rendering tab is where we figure out what our smoke and fire shaders look like. It's probably worth pointing out now that at this point, Turbulence isn't so great for liquids, so water or anything like that. What Turbulence really deals with are compressible fluids, air, gas, smoke, blah, blah. This is why it's predominantly focused on smoke and fire. Not when I used it. For
Same deal.
yeah, for liquids, real flow, or whatever's happened to NIAD, as a general rule. Right, okay, so let's take a little closer look at what's happening here. Come on, emitters, there we go. So the temperature mode is being set, in this case to a value of a little bit over 1, and then dropping off. And let's just look at the temperature channel and the temperature tab. There's one of these tabs for each of the 4 channels that one can set. Pretty straightforward, really. The clip below value just means any voxel with a value less than that is disregarded by the simulation. Temperature diffusion is how heat spreads through the simulation volume. Cooling is 2%, or these two values are related. The half-life of the temperature, currently 34.3. Both of these values are in frames. So each voxel will be cooling 2% of its set temperature value per frame, or once a voxel's been set to a temperature, after 34.3096 frames, it will be at half the temperature it was. So if I set a shorter half-life, it'll recompute the cooling percentage. If I set a higher cooling percentage, it'll recompute the half-life. It's just some people find the half-life to be more intuitive. So you think, oh, after this amount of time, half the temperature. Great. But you've got both. The one difference being that you can actually envelope the cooling percentage. So if you want to discontinue a heat effect, you can use the cooling envelope to suddenly, well, cryogenically freeze your sim volume. Buoyancy is the function of heat rising, of convection. And buoyancy direction is obviously the vector along which that's applied. Why would you want to fiddle with what direction things convect, Mark? I hear nobody ask. But one example would be if you've got something burning in zero gravity, like in the recent movie Gravity, you could have flame rolling along a ceiling and being pushed towards the floor and then falling back up to the ceiling. Because it's a zero gravity environment, you want the flame to stick to the ceiling. You can control the direction that the convection and collapsing forces are working on. Good so far? Sweet. So our emitters are pumping temperature into the sim volume, and that's the behavior of all that is controlled in the temperature tab thus. Again, with the burn mode, bit simpler a panel, because that's burn is treated just as flame incandescence. It doesn't have the convection function of temperature, so it's more a simple cosmetic effect, which is kind of useful if you just want to, for example, ignite something and not really worry about in-depth simulations. Again, clip below. If something's below that value, it's disregarded by the simulation. Burn diffusion is, again, how much that effect will be spread out through the sim volume. Decay mode, pretty straightforward. And again, our familiar decay per frame, percentage, or a set half-life. So if we start from first principles, clear the scene, add a container from the Turbulence menu. So it still makes me twitch that it says that it's fluid space container, because back in the day when rendering things with spaces in their file names was bad over Screamernet, it's still with me. So I'm just going to park that sim volume on the ground there. Bring open my container window. Voxel size 20 millimeter, that's a little dainty. Let's say 50 millimeters. 4 wide, 5 tall, 4 wide in the Z. I'm not going to worry about centering that, life's too short. So I'm going to bring in one of these little hemispheres.
That is just a piece of geometry?
That is
Whatever you want it to
just a piece of geometry. You can use any shape geometry you like as an emitter. And I'll be covering some rather useful things to do with that.
So you can have a digital stuntman catch on fire and tumble and animate and all
Yeah. Okay. So, I am allowed in public. I brought in my geometry. I'm just looking around it. Yes, it's fully ensconced within the simulation volume. I'm going to bring open my emitters panel. And then, with that geometry selected, Turbulence FD menus, make emitter. Pop. So just keeping it simple, I'm going to say at frame 0, let's have you emitting temperature at 5, and then ramping off over 10 frames to 0. And I'm going to check my container volume settings. Yep, caching temperature by default, that's handy. Simulation, look in the temperature tab. Yep, that's active by default. Notice that not everything is active by default. By default, temperature is, because it's kind of figured that you want things to react realistically. Let's check that my viewport render, set to temperature. Lovely. Start sim. Whoop, choose cache directory. Don't want to write it to Gen's C drive. We've been friends.
It's not that big at all.
Also, we've been friends for years and I don't want to ruin your computer. So, this illuminated keyboard was a genius idea, Jen. Thank you. Select folder, and off it goes. So that's just, as you can see, I didn't have anything up my sleeves. That was just the default settings. So we're here with our, and again, I want to reiterate, this is a gamer-grade graphics card. So
It's like $100 card. Imagine what you could do with one of the pricey ones.
yeah. Okay. So let's take a closer look at what's actually happening in the sim. We've got this lovely plasma jellyfish effect happening here. And remember, we just emitted a brief pulse into the temperature channel. So as it cuts off, it's being pulled upwards by the convection effect. We didn't apply a velocity to our emitter. There's no wind. There's not even any set turbulence at this point. So this little mushroom cloud doohickey is literally just the annular effect of this hemispherical shell of heat rising up and pulling stuff up from beneath. So let's,
Like in VPR, or is it already?
in VPR, it won't look like too much because it's just got the basic fire shader applied to it. Look at this, it's working in VPR. That's cool. I shouldn't sound surprised by that, but I'm not getting paid by the people who wrote this, so. That said, I do really enjoy it whenever I've got an excuse to use this for work. We'll be taking a nice close look at how the fire shader is set up as we go along. So that's all well and cool. But this gives us a nice excuse, I think, to take a look at some of the other things we can do. As you can see, that's really regular. Regular is a bit boring. So to hammer home the fact that you can use any geometry whatsoever, I'm just going to jump into the Deform tab and apply some displacement. Just going to apply procedural ripples. Maybe ripples too, we'll see. Just take a look at how that works. Okay, that looks wibbly sufficiently to me. So if I just resim that, actually I'm going to go in and turn and remove that envelope so that the emission rate is constant. And I'm going to restart that sim. And as you can see, the emission is from the displaced object. Bearing in mind that, as a rule, having a smooth lobe of flame is not really what we want, the fact that we can use displacements to perturb the emission volume is actually really nice. Whee! Hello.
Does the density of the mesh have a lot to do with, have a big effect on it?
Well, it has a direct effect on the shape of the data that's emitted, and the accuracy of that shape is directly here in the voxel size. So if you've got something with 1 meter wide polygons in a 50 millimeter voxel size container, you'll have 20 voxels for that 1 meter stretch. If my maths is wrong, please feel free to tell me at any time. So with a voxel size of 50 millimeters, if I had 50 millimeters, that's 5 centimeters, that's about that much. If I had a model of my hand, that voxel size is going to be too big to find my fingers. But the fingers as a whole, being contained within a voxel, will be enough to emit. Good so far?
Yeah.
Sweet. And please ask questions at any time. That's why it's. So there we have a procedurally displaced emitter object. Now I think it's actually kind of a big point that you can emit from pretty much whatever you like. It'll respect subdivision surfaces, and let's try some particles, shall we? So let's add a particle emitter. Shouldn't really matter. So I'm just going to quickly set up my emitter. I'm going to put it to the side of the sim volume. And because I wasn't paying close enough attention, I'm going to hit play while I add these values in. There we go. Excellent. As you can see, it's using its existing cache data until I tell it to do something different. So, FX emitter is good enough for right now. FX tools, Turbulence FD, emitters, and make emitter with my particle source selected. Okay, to revisit the General tab, we've now got some things to pay attention to, such as the radius value. That's applying a radius value to each of those particles. Now, I can, in fact, use some of the particle data. I can take my size from the FX emitter particles. I can extract data for age, mass, velocity. Pretty cool. And then I can map, using this function curve, that particle data. Let's not worry about that right now. We will be spending time on function curves because they're about half of what makes TFD TFD. Pardon me. So I'm going to cheat utterly and make my particle radius exactly 1 voxel. And I'm going to say each particle is adding a temperature of 5. And rather than mucking around, too much, I'm just going to take those values, run the sim, and see what happens. So, everyone who ever wanted a flamethrower but wasn't allowed, it's your lucky day. There is actually a flamethrower demo scene that we'll be playing with in a little while. But, as you can see, that is actually really straightforward and comprehensible. Each particle is just being virtually replaced with a 50 millimeter sphere, or 1 voxel. In fact, you can pretty much see each voxel if I nail the right angle there. Or the wrong one, depending on your point of view. And that's just throwing temperature into the sim volume in a way that actually makes a lot of sense if you think about it for 2 seconds. It's just, I'm sure I'm surrounded by incredibly smart people, but when I first saw Turbulence FD, well, when I first saw Fume even, I was sort of thinking, oh God, how do I make any of this work? None of this makes any sense, and there are so many controls. But again, all the controls make perfect sense in context.
How long
So,
did it take you to get up to speed?
probably about a month.
Is that daily use or just dabbling with it here and there?
Yeah,
in your spare time?
dabbling with it in my spare time. Holding down my day job, because the documentation is actually worth reading, and the concepts themselves are pretty much high school physics. The execution of those concepts is way higher than high school physics. I mean, this is basically a packet physics package, which is some, historically speaking, pretty heavy messing. But actually using it, you don't need huge amounts of scientific knowledge. Okay, just to make a point, I've set the particle size to smaller than an individual voxel. But as with oh so many things in LightWave, as long as you keep it in its comfort zone of about 0 to 10 meters, the default values will work for most things.
So within 10 meters is the Turbulence FD comfort zone?
Pretty much.
So if you have to set a city on fire, do it at that and scale it up?
Yeah, but that's generally safest, it
Sounds like
seems.
real flow and bullet.
Yeah, funny that, isn't it? And there are times where, well, I'll cover some of the places where it's really easy to catch yourself out in terms of quantization of the data. There's one problem that is kind of the rite of passage for anyone using TFD, which is using a really low value in the density channel because you just want a gentle wisp of smoke. This is a mistake because those really low values can clip and leave a hard border around your smoke. So using a higher value and then tweaking the function curve for smoke density is a better way to do that, but we'll come back to that later.
Can you scale the cache for rendering or for playback? Like you can size it for playback the way you can size a piece of geometry?
Let me select my fluid container, modify, size,
Yay! Alright, that answers that.
translate. Whee!
Yeah, because real flow has an issue with scale.
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, bullet can...
I'm rotating my volume.
Does it have any effect on what's going on inside the volume? Can you animate that volume? And
That's
will it
perfectly
affect
fine.
anything that's going on inside?
Are we having fun yet?
You could do some smoke, put it in a crystal ball with the witches passing around.
Absolutely.
Nice.
So there's a lot of freedom here. Of course, you want to keep your finger away from the Calculate Sim button if you're doing this kind of thing.
That's actually what I had in mind.
Well, if your emitters are moving such that they're still impinging on the sim volume, go for it. But this is actually great because, random example, on that movie that I've already mentioned 3 times, so I'm not going to say it just yet for another half hour, I came up with a palette of explosions and smoke trails, and attaching them to bits of blowy-uppy spaceship or exploding fighter jet became trivial. So having, as I've been using it, having a toolbox that contains smoke plumes and gushes of smoke, smoke rings, and different types of burn, it's great. It's the incandescent version of your Nerny folder.
Nice.
So there is an awful lot of flexibility to be had here. Okay, everybody with me so far? Understand what I did? And
I do have a question.
please.
After the smoke comes out, it reaches the apex of the container
Mm-hmm.
and then kind of has nowhere to go.
Yep.
Can you enlarge that, and does it cause any ramification?
Okay.
That it doesn't reach the peak?
If I go back to where we were and take a emitter, I will address that exact issue right now. FX Tools, Turbulence, Make Emitter, Channels, Temperature, Value 5, Frame 10, Value 0, close enough, I don't hate the number 11. And let's just sim that quickly. So, that's hitting the top there.
And treats it as collision, because it seems to...
And it's down here. Simulation tab, Solver. Note down at the bottom, I've got close boundaries. So if I close the plus y boundary and resim, doink. And now it's spilling out in the x and z directions. So if I close the sim volume completely, donk, and the pressures therein are contained and dissipate as one would expect.
Can you tilt the container more?
What again? Whoops. Like that?
Yeah, and then rerun the sim.
Do you want that container rotating throughout the course of the sim, or just... Why not? It's Sunday.
It doesn't seem to be really aware of the fact that the container is tilted. Seems pretty symmetric still.
Yep, it does, doesn't it?
Spin it faster.
I'm not actually certain. Let me just double check if there's something saying local axes or world axes. I think in this case that might not actually do it. Let me just try that less fancy and see if it works. Okay, so we've definitely got a local Y. See, this is why I love it when people ask questions. They come up with things that I haven't tried yet. So that's definitely showing an internal y-axis, isn't it? Right. Good question.
So, because I was thinking, like in Iron Sky, when you have like the.
I didn't say it. I didn't say it that time.
My name's in the credits too. When you have the zeppelins and you want to have an explosion coming out this way. Or,
Yeah.
You know.
With that, those were actually exactly my shots. What I did with that was have a volume roughly the proportions of a toothpaste tube box, and zip a sphere through the volume, emitting as it went. And then I took that volume and just plugged it into the zeppelins to follow the same angle as the shots passing through. So they were all local Y that-a-way, because I figured it's a free-fall environment in vacuo, so that was my excuse for being quite so lazy. I'm mildly amused that I didn't actually simulate any of them off-axis. I was simulating them on the axis like this. So it's an interesting experiment. I was half expecting the fluid to travel up through the volume and gather in the apex, but as we can see, that hasn't happened. However, things gathering in apices, this is probably as good a time as any to start playing with colliders. And it's just occurred to me, I may be making a rod for my own back, but let's see what happens.
And again, if you turn off auto scan plugins.
Okay. Prepare to be amazed by my modeling prowess. I'm not self-aggrandizing. Okay, so despite the apparent complexity of the interface, it is actually really easy to do most of the important things that one would hope for in TFD. As you can see, I've made a box. Thank you, thank you. It will be available for purchase after the session. Go into my TFD panel, make collision. Okay, that was hard. Containers, start sim. Okay, now, hold on. Did I? Yeah, oh yeah, there we go. So our pulse of temperature is now meeting that inclined cuboid and colliding with it. It's not.
Is the presence of the box as a collision object what caused that deflection at the very outset?
There's nothing else to be doing it. See the.
It's down to was it animated before?
Yeah.
Okay, I
Yep.
didn't realize that.
That's
'Cause, I mean, otherwise it should have gone straight up, hit it, and then fanned out. Right?
Yep. But if I play back. If I create a key at 0, delete that key there, run the sim again.
Mark, you were saying you had the volume and you shot a sphere through it?
Yeah.
Interesting. So it enters and exits the volume.
Yes. Would you like to see that next? Why not? Okay, so pretty much what we were expecting from that with the now static inclined plane.
I was confused initially when I said it.
Yeah, sorry, I could have made that clearer. That was my bad. Okay, let's clear the scene down.
Enjoyed Eye of the Sky much more than Brad.
It had more laughs in it, for sure. Let's add ourselves a container. Use our handy dandy modeler tools, just make a ball, or a sphere, as grown-ups call them. Let's make our container, let's say 5 meters long. Everything else is fine. And now let's just animate our sphere. Frame 0. Frame 40. Nice leisurely stroll through there. My sphere is currently about 0.17 meters across. Let's see what my voxel size is. 20 millimeters. Yeah, again, life's too short. So, with sphere selected, make emitter. Let's set a temperature of, let's say 3. And sticking with temperature is good because it does interesting things like convects, and it's on by default. So you may fire when you are ready, Mr. Gridley. It's asking me for a cache directory, TFD demo, new folder. I'm not even going to bother being clever there. So really straightforward. Whilst the emitter object is not inside the simulation volume, it's not altering the data set. While it is inside the simulation volume, it is altering the data set. It is possible. Where is it? Where is it? Where is it? It is possible, should be possible. Thought that was switched on. Okay, never mind. Pretty straightforward so far. And if we are feeling fruity, we can keyframe any value of our object that we like. So let's have it actually hit size 0 at that point. Submit it. So the amount of control I've got over the emission surface is pretty total. It's pretty nifty that way. I'm doing it. I'm doing it. Sorry, background in science, British accent. Of course I'm mad. Did Hollywood teach you nothing? Okay, but as you can see, exactly what you'd hope for in keyframing an emission object. It just kind of works. Everyone happy so far?
Yeah.
Skipped anything that you'd rather I put more detail into? Cool. Let's move on then.